Hi everyone, and welcome to the History of the Bible. In today's video, we're going to be focusing on the Old Testament. My name is MJ from Bible Intelligence, and let's just jump straight into it. So, the universal history from year 0, whenever that was, to 2200 BC. So God creates the world in 6 days, and then he rests on the 7th. Adam and Eve live in the Garden of Eden. They eat the forbidden fruit and are kicked out of paradise. Cain and Abel make offerings to God. Cain's is rejected, and so he goes and kills his brother Abel. God is displeased with the world and plans to send a flood, but he does tell Noah to build an ark so that they can survive it. The descendants of Noah start to build a tower to heaven. God confuses their language and scatters the people throughout the world. And this concludes the universal history. We then have the period of patriarchs, and this is from 2200 BC to 1446 BC. So God allows Satan to test Job's faith. Job succeeds and is blessed by God. Then God calls Abraham and says he will be the father of many nations. Abraham proves his faith to God by almost sacrificing his son Isaac. Isaac has twin boys, Jacob and Esau. Jacob wrestles with God and is renamed Israel and has 12 sons. Joseph is the favorite son, but is sold by his brothers into slavery. Joseph rises in the ranks of Egypt by interpreting dreams. We then come to the Exodus, which is 1446 BC to 1406 BC. A new pharaoh enslaves the Israelites and aims to kill all Hebrew baby boys. So Moses, as a baby, is placed in a basket where Pharaoh's daughter finds him and raises him. Moses kills an Egyptian and flees to Midian and becomes a shepherd. There, God appears to Moses in a burning bush and tells him to lead his people. Pharaoh refuses to release the people, and so God sends 10 plagues. Pharaoh then agrees to let the people go, but while they are leaving, he chases them. This is when Moses then leads the people across the Red Sea by parting the waters, only for the waters to then crush on Pharaoh and his chasing chariots. God gives Moses the 10 commandments on a tablet, but Moses breaks them when he sees the people worshipping a golden calf. The Hebrew people then wander in the wilderness for 40 years. We then have the Promised Land, or the period of Judges, from 1406 BC to 1350 BC. Joshua succeeds Moses and leads the people across the Jordan River. After marching for 7 days, the wall of Jericho falls and the conquests begin. After Joshua's death, a series of judges rule over Israel. Most notably is Gideon, who succeeds in battle with just 300 men and has a peace for 40 years. There's also Samson, who succeeds in battle single-handedly, but he is then tricked by Delilah, who cuts his hair, causes his strength to be lost. Ruth, a Moabite widow, goes to Bethlehem and marries Boaz. Why is this important? Because Ruth will become the great-grandmother of King David, who will come a bit later. Samuel is the final judge and leads the people through a time of peace, but the people demand to have a king so they can be like all the other nations. And so we have Israel's monarchy from 1350 BC to 586 BC. Saul is made king, but is disobedient to God. David defeats Goliath and succeeds Saul as king. David expands the kingdom, but has a few moral failures. His son Solomon succeeds him as king and is wise and builds the temple. But Solomon's wives lead him into idolatry, and the trouble begins to start. After his death, the kingdom is split into Israel, which is in the north with 10 tribes, and 2 in the south called Judah. Now, the north has a capital of Samaria. It has many kings, but is known for idolatry and conflict. In the south, we've got Judah and their capital, Jerusalem. It's more stable, but also has periods of idolatry and reform. And this is when we see a lot of prophetic activity. Many rise up to warn the kings and the people to turn back to God. However, they don't listen, and the Assyrians conquer the north, leading to the 10 lost tribes of Israel, because when the Assyrians conquer, they scatter the people amongst their empire, leading them to kind of become the lost tribes. Whereas when the Babylonians conquered the south, yes, they destroyed the temple, but they took the people as a collective back to Babylon, where the people there lived as exiled. So let's talk about the exile and the post-exile. This is the final period from 586 BC to 430 BC. During this time, Daniel rises up. He becomes known for his wisdom and his ability to interpret dreams. He serves in the royal courts and maintains his faith even when he's thrown in the lion's den. A Persian king called Cyrus conquers Babylon and allows the Jews to return and rebuild Jerusalem. Zerubbabel leads the people and they rebuild the second temple. Esther, a Jewish woman, becomes queen of Persia and prevents a genocide against her people. Ezra leads a second wave and enforces religious reforms and the law of Moses. Nehemiah, a cupbearer to the Persian king, returns to rebuild Jerusalem's walls. Malachi is the last Old Testament prophet, and he speaks of a future Messiah. Now let's look at the history of the Bible between the Testaments. This is known as the Second Temple period from 430 BC to 0 AD. The Persians continue to rule the region for another 100 years before Alexander the Great conquers them and introduces the Greek language and culture to the region. But after his death, his generals fight over Israel. For the first 100 years, it's with the Ptolemaic dynasty, but then control shifts to the Seleucids. And the Seleucids, they increase the Hellenization, they persecute the Jews, and they desecrate the temple. King Antiochus sets up an altar to Zeus in God's temple and sacrifices dirty pigs. This causes Judas Maccabeus to successfully lead a revolt and rededicate the temple. Thus, an independent Jewish state under the Hasmonean dynasty lasts for 80 years. However, Roman general Pompey captures Jerusalem and appoints Herod as king. Now, Herod the Great is brutal, but he builds up Jerusalem and he expands the temple. After his death, Judea becomes a Roman province. Now we shift to the New Testament and let's go through that history. So the New Testament is from 0 AD to 95 AD, and it starts when the angel Gabriel visits Mary to announce that she will give birth to the Son of God. Jesus is born in Bethlehem and is visited by the Magi and the shepherds. John the Baptist preaches and paves the way for Jesus and baptizes him. After his baptism, Jesus fasts for 40 days and is tempted by Satan. Jesus performs miracles and teaches for 3 years. Jesus is then arrested, trialed, and crucified, but rises from the dead on the third day. 40 days after his resurrection, Jesus appears to his disciples and ascends into heaven. 40 days after that, the Holy Spirit descends on the disciples and the church starts. Paul is converted on the road to Damascus after he had been persecuting the Christians. Paul then journeys across the Roman Empire, spreading the Christian message. But for this, he will be arrested, imprisoned, and taken to Rome for trial, where he writes his letters that forms most of the New Testament. And the final book in the Bible is the Apostle John. It's the book of Revelations, where he receives these prophetic visions about the second coming of Christ. And that is the history of the Bible.